Do you mind if
Yeah.
over real quick? Okay, cancel this speaker.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the Research Spotlight Series presented by Michigan State University's CIBER and the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University. In today's webinar, we're now entering our third year of webinars, we will be discussing the use of meta-analysis in international business research. We have three excellent speakers today who've published well on this topic and have written a number of both methodological and substantive pieces related to meta-analysis. In today's seminar, we will have first, we'll be hearing from Ahmet Kirca from Michigan State University. Then we will be hearing from Irina Kozlenskova, I can't read, Kozlenskova from University of Virginia, and then Sjoerd Bergenza from the University of Groningen. I would like to thank the CIBER at Michigan State University staff and the staff at the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University for supporting us in this endeavor. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Ahmet. Ahmet, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as David mentioned, we've been offering these research spotlights for over 2 years now. We're in our third year. And thank you for joining us. So today we're going to talk a little bit about meta-analysis. And if you have any questions, please write those in the chat and let David know. And David is going to look at those and then give us the best questions that he will pick from those, and we'll try to do our best to answer your questions. So let me share my screen and just say a few things about meta-analysis, and then I'm sure others are going to okay, just a second. Yep. All right. So I'll start with a definition, with the definition of meta-analysis, and briefly talk about the strengths and weaknesses of meta-analysis, and then lay out the steps of how to conduct a meta-analysis, and then get the questions and answers at the end. So what is a meta-analysis? Meta-analysis is a quantitative review technique that allows us to take stock of knowledge, to aggregate findings, integrate findings across studies in a particular domain by systematically combining and synthesizing findings. Those three pieces are underlying because those are really the key issues: quantitative, aggregation, integration, consolidation of research across findings, and it has to be systematic. And as you're going to see in the next couple of steps that I'm going to talk about, I will heavily emphasize these issues. So we're combining findings across studies to provide empirical generalizations about phenomena across different research contexts. So we are interested here mean effects. Each study is one data point in a meta-analysis. And we aggregate the findings of these studies and compare study findings to examine the effects of substantive and methodological characteristics that might not otherwise be available because we're focusing on one single study. Each study is embedded in a context, and that's why we need to aggregate the findings across the studies to come up with generalizations. So, and of course, the third objective of a meta-analysis is to test theory using more comprehensive factors that than those that might have to collection of data from 10 different countries. So if we can use meta-analysis to test theory by aggregating findings across different studies, across different contexts, then we can gain knowledge about issues that might not have been available otherwise. So science is a cooperative and cumulative enterprise. Thousands of new scientific studies are completed every year, and there are certain qualitative limitations of qualitative reviews and vote counting methods that would push us in this direction. Why meta-analysis? Why do we do meta-analysis? So this is basically from a paper published in 2020, and it just shows us how many more meta-analyses are coming. Articles are published every year in business management and organization studies. So, and this one gives us an idea about the number of meta-analyses published in international business marketing and management disciplines between 1980 and 2009. That's from our paper published in the International Business Review in 2010. And as you can see, IB journals have been underrepresented in this population. Management and then marketing, as of 2009, were the leading journals, fields that published meta-analysis. That changed over the last 14 years or so, 13 years or so. Basically, now we see a huge number of meta-analyses published in international business journals. Marketing still is probably number 2, and management is still there. But up until then, as you can see in JIPS, there were only 5 meta-analyses. That number is much higher today. So this is the same thing with the graph, and as you can see, the general trend in the number of meta-analyses published in IB management and marketing journals. So one other reason I'm interested in working with meta-analyses is that meta-analyses allow us to provide empirical generalizations, which are useful for teaching and practice. And that's exactly where we see, that's exactly why fields like medical field or psychology have been a little farther away or in much better shape in terms of integrating this empirical finding, academic findings with practice and with their teaching. I think we still have some ways to go in that regard. But there are some excellent books out there, at least in marketing, that looks at empirical generalizations about the impact of marketing. And there's actually a nice YouTube video that presents the highlights from the book. So there are 5 stages of the meta-analytic process, and I'm really not going to spend too much time on each of those, but just provide some general recommendations, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. One thing that I would like to emphasize here is that meta-analytic research process is an iterative process. It's not linear. So You start with problem definition, go to literature search and data collection, the data coding evaluation, and then go back to problem formulation sometimes, literature search, and so on and so forth. So that's something that you need to remember if you want to conduct a meta-analysis. So some of the recommendations for the first stage, the problem formulation stage, read. You really have to be very familiar with the literature. You can't just go out there and then, okay, well, this is an interesting topic, and there are a lot of studies there, and then I'm going to do a meta-analysis. You have to start with the existing literature, where that comes from, and understand the literature before you can actually and preferably publish in that stream of literature if you can actually if you want to publish, if you want to work on a meta-analysis. You have to read key empirical and conceptual articles. It's not just a coding process. Coding is just part of it. You have to understand the literature, the empirical and conceptual articles to be able to do a good meta-analysis. Qualitative, quantitative reviews of literature. What are the common variables? Keep an eye on the contradictory findings, because that provides an opportunity, a meta-analysis provides you with an opportunity to consolidate the findings, integrate the findings, and help us understand why we have those contradictory findings with our moderator analysis. And develop a preliminary theoretical framework for your meta-analysis. So for the second stage, retrieval, well, keywords, looking at references of key studies, highly cited key publications, manual searches of relevant journals. This is a lot easier than it used to be in the past. I literally, for my first meta-analysis, I did a manual search of every single journal out there that I included in my list. Went to the library, took out all the issues of the journals, and went over each one page of JM and all the other paper journals that I had included in my manual searches. But now it's a lot easier, obviously. But other steps don't really change. Solicit studies, working papers, request of unpublished studies, screening criteria. You need to be very, very clear about this. I cannot overemphasize the importance of tracking everything and making it very clear, crystal clear in your papers what you are doing for the retrieval and data coding and evaluation stage. I would recommend you to use multiple coders and use intercoder reliability scores, because this is really one of the most subjective steps of the meta-analysis. And as a reviewer, I really worry about the quality of the study. The meta-analysis, I mean, every paper published in a good journal should be replicable, but it's maybe more true for meta-analysis. So you have to make sure that your method section is very clearly written, so that people can actually replicate what you did. Data analysis, univariate analysis, having a descriptive statistics table. I still see papers without the descriptive statistics table. Table 1, mean effect sizes for the relationships included in the meta-analysis. I would really like to see that in every single meta-analysis. You can use bivariate analysis. Random effects model is probably the best approach to go, unless you have a strong reason to believe that fixed effects model are more appropriate for your analysis, which is kind of rare in business. But these are some minor, some important details, but we can really cover all of those here. And try to analyze the meta-analytic correlation metrics despite its limitations for theory testing purposes when you can. But the number of effect sizes per cell in your aggregate correlation metrics, meta-analytic correlation metrics, is important. In my opinion, if you have less than 5, ideally less than 10, actually, you probably don't have enough studies to run to use meta-analysis for theory testing purposes, but I would really like to hear others' opinions on this. So it's about stability of the effect sizes and what you include in the aggregate correlation metrics is basically what you get at the end, right? So that's why it's important to have high numbers of effect sizes per cell there, in my opinion. Summary variables, practical and theoretical implications, and so on. So I'm just going to end up here with 2 more slides. There are several limitations of meta-analyses. You can compare apples and oranges. One of the biggest problems that I see is apples and oranges problem. I mean, we just come up with these huge aggregate constructs, and I don't want to name names, but there are so many papers out there that just capability. Well, you know, everything under the sun becomes capabilities, and then you have to be really very specific about your definition. The face validity, as well as we cannot assess the psychometric properties of meta-analytic studies included in a meta-analysis, but you have to keep that in mind. Do they really hang together? Do you really have convergent validity? Do you have discriminant validity or not for the constructs that you include in your meta-analysis? Some recommendations. These have been my to-go books all the time, and I also wanted to mention briefly that I would like to go back to the original work rather than citing somebody who had done something in another meta-analysis published in some journals. Just go back. These are really excellent books that give you a lot of ideas. Practical meta-analysis is practical. It's the easiest one. It's about 150 pages. Lipsy and Wilson. Start with that. Go. I think there's a 3rd edition of the Cooper and Hedges book now. Schmidt and Hunter. Those are really the foundations for your meta-analysis, and I would strongly recommend you to read these books if you want to publish in a good journal. Some additional readings, my favorite readings on this topic are also included. So I'll be happy to share these slides, and I can probably talk about this for 2 weeks, and I did that in a workshop actually for 5 days, 6 hours a day. We're in a room, and it was fun, very intellectually stimulating, but I probably should stop now because otherwise David is going to get upset with me.
And I would never get upset with you, but thank you so much for sharing your initial thoughts on this. We already have some questions in the Q&A, which we're going to hold most of those till the end so that we can share them with the full panel. Now it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Irina. Irina, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. My name is Irina Kozlankova. I'm an assistant professor at University of Virginia. Prior to that, I was actually same department as Ahmet at Michigan State, and know David pretty well. So we don't have a lot of time, so let me see. Can I share screen? Yeah. Okay. Okay, are you guys seeing that?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, all right. So Ahmet actually mentioned a lot of the tips I was going to share, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on talking about, what meta-analysis do. I want to mention a couple of things. So meta-analysis can also, besides publishing a meta-analysis hopefully in some top journal, it can also generate a lot of other research ideas for you to implement in your research stream. It also establishes, how does the meta-analysis help you as the author? Establishes you as an expert in the domain. It might help to put you on some editorial review board. And meta-analyses tend to get cited pretty well. And this is something that at least in the US, you know, if you go up for full, they will look at your citations at some institutions. I wanted to make one caveat for meta-analytic research, and that is that I guess that really depends on your institution, but there is a view out there that, you know, meta-analyses are not original research, right? These are not your novel ideas. The novel ideas came from these primary studies. So at some places, meta-analytic research might be discounted, and that's one of the problems with it. But at the same time, what I'm seeing in top journals is that it's really impossible to publish a meta-analysis that does not make a substantial theoretical contribution. And because that's sort of the requirement and the bar at top journals, that sort of helps to alleviate this previous point I was making on some people being concerned that this is, you know, not really original research that you're doing. And what do I mean by substantial theoretical contribution? Maybe, you know, you conduct a meta-analysis and you try to explain it from a perspective of maybe you realize there's another boundary condition. Maybe the results of the meta-analysis allow you to introduce some sort of typology. So think of a meta-analysis then as just sort of the first step and the first contribution of your research. All right, so Ahmet mentioned the key steps, and I'm just going to make a couple of points on some of these steps. All right, picking a research topic. So I would say I don't see meta-analyses, whether, you know, the meta-analyses that we're trying to work on or as a reviewer, that have less than 40 papers. I don't think I've seen a meta-analysis. You can do that with fewer studies, but I would say to be safe, you need at least 40 papers. Check if a meta-analysis on this topic has been done. Right, we get excited if it hasn't been done, but if it hasn't been done, then you have to ask the question of, okay, if it's such an obvious topic to you to do a meta-analysis, why hasn't it been done? So maybe it's an old construct that people just don't care about anymore. Maybe it's not done because there aren't enough studies. I recently had a paper to review at a top journal, a top marketing journal, where they did a meta-analysis. And I quickly looked up the subject, and it turned out there is a meta-analysis in healthcare, in a healthcare journal that basically did the same thing, but they had, you know, different labels for their constructs. So check other disciplines. Just because it hasn't been published in international business or marketing doesn't mean it's not out there. So yeah, it should be in an area where there is a need to synthesize and a topic that we care about today and will care about in the future. Ahmet already covered this point really well. You should be knowledgeable in the domain and read a lot, and or you might want to become knowledgeable, but that's normally, you know, somebody who's going to be less senior on the paper, and maybe the RA, the coder. Okay, you should look for a topic where there are interesting main effects, where there's variance in main effects, and where you think there might be a potential for moderators to explain the differences in these effects. And the moderators, where do they normally come from if you look at meta-analyses? So they might come from the study level variables. So those are, so everything about the original studies. Maybe it comes from the sample that was used in the original paper. So maybe they studied this relationship in a B2C context. Some people maybe have studied it in a B2B context. So it comes from the differences in samples. Also, where does their sample come from? In a lot of international business studies, right, you're going to see samples from different countries. So think of potential moderators. Collecting papers. I think Ahmet also made a lot of the points that I was going to highlight here. So which disciplines are you going to search? Like what makes sense for you? Which journals, and what is your cutoff for journals, and why is that the cutoff? Some people use citations, right, as an indicator of quality, but that probably eliminates a lot of newer papers that have not had the chance to gain the citations over time. So you kind of have to be mindful of that. Timeline, right? If we're looking at a somewhat recent phenomenon, like, so we did a meta-analysis on sharing economy. Sharing economy is not that old. So you kind of have to figure out what makes sense for the relationships that you're studying. Should you include unpublished studies, and how will you, if you do, how are you going to assess the quality of those studies? Snowballing, I think Ahmet actually talked about it, maybe without using the term snowballing. That's where you look at the references of the original papers, see who they cite, look at the papers that they cite. I'm always cautious when I see as a reviewer that the team has not used that technique, right? They just searched by key terms, and that was the set of their studies. I think snowballing allows you to be much more comprehensive, and it also allows you to see, okay, this construct that I'm studying, has it been called, and what are the other aliases that have been used in the literature, right? So then it allows you to find more studies and really understand what it is you're talking about. Definitional precision is really important. And so let me give you an example. When we were looking for papers on sharing economy, people included all sorts of firms that they called sharing economy, which by our definition, we didn't think truly reflected that construct. So then you have to really understand their sample and see, okay, does that fall in your conceptual definition of that construct, regardless of other people calling them sharing economy firms? So I also see that there's increased attention on content validity, and not just for the focal construct, but for all the constructs, right? Like matching the construct, what it conceptually is supposed to be, to how it was operationalized in the research. I think the standards for that are going up. So there needs to be like a very diligent and cautious job, and to look at these operationalizations and see, do they truly match this construct or a list of constructs? So this is a similar point. So really think about what it is that you're studying and not studying, like what is this scope to rule studies in and out? On the bright side, when you're really clear about your definition, and I see a lot of metas do this, a lot of metas will have an extensive section in the beginning that talk just about the definition of maybe their core construct. And they say, okay, we think this is it, and this is not part of that construct. So I think it also helps you to bring, that could be one of your theoretical contributions, right? Clarifying the scope. Be really clear in what you cannot include. We had that same paper, sharing economy, we had reviewers ask us for kind of a meta on the providers, like the hosts of Airbnb, or Uber drivers, why do they participate in sharing economy? And unfortunately, we could not address that because we did not have, there were not enough studies for us to do that. All we could do is look at people who ride in an Uber or guests of Airbnb. So we couldn't really provide the other side of that relationship. A couple points on positioning and writing. I think it really pays off to illustrate why you're looking at whatever problem you're looking at. So I'll give you an example. We spent some time in the paper talking about, okay, well, sharing economy is a big deal. This is how many $billions it's worth to the economy. This is how much of GDP it constitutes for all these different countries. We also looked at, okay, well, why has there been a shift? Why are people willing to participate in sharing economy? So there are these like societal shifts that people prefer to own less and rent more. So maybe they have money for other things that they want to do in their lives. And emphasizing the problem, like, okay, so why do a Meta? Well, we see these firms that succeed in some countries and fail in other countries. So why is that? So let's do a Meta to try to figure that out. So just kind of really be clear on why do this meta-analysis? What does it solve for people, for our understanding? Okay, so contributions. Be clear on like what inconsistencies you're trying to resolve. Maybe you found model that's not fully mediated. Well, does that mean there's a missing mediator that you could add to your model? Typically in the literatures that I tend to read, the biggest contribution from meta-analyses comes from the moderators by far. So I think it's safe to say that in marketing management, I guess international business, it is probably not possible to publish in top level journals, probably not possible to publish a meta on just main effects. There are two types in terms of how you structure a meta-analysis, right? Like you might offer formal hypotheses, or it might be more of exploratory nature where you just don't even know what to hypothesize, right? Maybe it's a newer phenomenon. Maybe the available theory to explain this phenomenon isn't really very solid yet, so it's tough to know what to hypothesize. So there are, you can find citations for people saying, hey, if it's a newer phenomenon, exploratory meta-analysis where you're not offering formal hypotheses and you're just trying to see what, you're just trying to establish these effects, that's fine. I would always, people read meta-analyses, right? Because they just want this screenshot or this really quick overview of the field. I think that good lit review tables really help. And I would also suggest, if it's possible for your topic, to do some post hocs of managerial implications to really say, hey, this is what we found, but this is what it actually means. And this is how firms maybe can use it. Other tips, these are not in any order. So Ahmet already mentioned having multiple coders. So normally those might be RAs, I don't know, some might be undergraduate students. And if you think about the work that they have to do to code, right, it's really monotonous. You're looking through article after article, and it may seem like they're not doing an important job, right? They're just looking through a manuscript and plugging in some numbers. So I think it's really worthwhile to explain, if when you're training your coders, what can happen if they misinterpret something, if they put a wrong number in a certain cell, right? It can really screw up your results. Another thing that I'm noticing is that the standards are evolving in terms of control variables. So it seems like you can no longer get away with just putting in correlations, between the two constructs maybe you're studying. You also need to control, let's say, maybe you want to control for firm size. So you can do these things in structural equation modeling. You could also, even with structural equation modeling, you could even include effects from the previous metas that were done on the subject. And this is an article I found that is pretty good at sort of going over some methodological challenges that you can find to read. And I'm sure our next speaker is actually probably going to talk, because they also have an excellent article on methodological obstacles. Okay, I would recommend that, if you have a journal that you're going to go to, if you have that in your mind, read their most recent metas, like see what their standards are, because they are evolving. And the number of metas have been going up, so you shouldn't have a problem finding recent ones to look over. I'm always of the mindset that you should give reviewers a little bit more than they ask for to get through the review process. So our typical process with any papers have been like, as soon as we submit, we start brainstorming about what else we could do, even if the reviewers don't ask for it, right? Then you look like you went the extra mile, you did more work. So for meta-analyses, that would mean, I would brainstorm about other possible moderators maybe you could include on the next round, and maybe start gathering that information. Also, just a lot of managers, right, also read these papers. So you want to be able to say what your results mean in some relatable, understandable terms. So I'll give you a couple examples from some papers. There's a paper on how well relationship marketing works in different countries. We'll try to, interpret the effect sizes into some other metric that people can understand. So I have given you a couple of different examples that you could see from different papers. And that's all I have, and looking forward to you guys' questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. That was absolutely wonderful. We have received a lot of questions, both in the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to hold back on those, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Sjoerd, so that Sjoerd can enlighten us a little bit more on meta-analysis. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, David. I hope everyone can hear me and can see the slides. So my name is Sjoerd Belsdijk at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And the thing, or the basis I'm going to use in this short talk is a piece that I wrote with two colleagues. So I would actually like to give all the credits to them and not to myself. So I'm here presenting joint work, essentially. Peer Steele and Herman Aguinis. And the reason why we were asked to write this was essentially that there was a prize-winning paper in 2010 in JIBS that received the JIBS Decade Award, but was based on a meta-analysis, and that was a trigger for us to think through, well, but 2010, that's already quite some years ago, and especially the last decade, exactly as Irina has been explaining to you, the standards have gone up really quickly. So what used to be okay back then is perhaps no longer okay. So I'm not going to refer to our discussion of that particular paper, but we use that paper as an example how standards have evolved, and we discuss those standards in the paper. So the paper is open access in JIBS. You can find it there. I'm going to take a snapshot of that, and I'm going to emphasize something which I think is very important in this process. And both Ahmet and Irina have been emphasizing this. So it may be too much of the same, but it's really critical. And if I see papers rejected for JIBS in this case, then it's mostly because exactly this part of the project is not clearly done or not clearly defined. So it's incredibly popular, but as I said, methods are changing very rapidly. What we try to do in this paper is provide a model where we structure the different steps in 4 stages. And we do so to help not only authors, but also reviewers. So let me take you by the hand and try to explain what happens when a meta-analysis paper comes in. So from the editorial perspective, then you would like a meta-analysis specialist to look at such a paper, but you would also like two scholars who made primary contributions and whose studies might actually be included in the meta-analysis, because you need expert opinions also on the topic itself. Very often it is the case that you send out reviews for invitations, and then some of these people might say, well, it's a meta-analysis. I know a lot about the topic, but I feel a bit uncomfortable reviewing the meta-analytical part. So I don't know if I'm able to do this. So we also provide this. So this paper is especially also meant for people who might not do a meta-analysis themselves, but who every now and then are asked to review a meta-analysis or want to interpret the meta-analysis as a reader or as a user. So it's from both perspectives that we try to integrate that into the storyline. Now, as I said, I'm going to highlight one specific issue, but before we get there, some generic remarks. Ahmet already said the average effect size across studies in the field is highly attractive, because that almost sounds like, I don't think if Irina used that word, but it almost sounds like the ultimate finding of a field, right? The relationship is weak, strong, or is moderated by. But that feels like a statement you can include in the introduction of a paper you're writing. So that's why you would like to refer to a meta-analysis. And that's why meta-analyses are very popular. What I hear very often, I'll get back to that at the end, is that, well, you know, as a PhD student, I'm need to write my lit review anyway. So if I'm reading so much, why don't I just start coding these papers? Because I'm reading and going through them anyway. So why not do that? I'm actually quite critical of this approach. So we're going to talk about that perhaps in the discussion section, if I forget to talk about it at the end of my talk. When it's well done, a meta-analysis can really be summarizing the state of the art and push the research frontier. So that's the ideal meta-analysis. But when it's poorly done, it really can frustrate advance of a field, because you create confusion in a field. You obscure research findings that might actually, even if you would have done a qualitative review of the literature, might actually be quite clear, but by coding them in the wrong way, you get a formal empirical result that only creates confusion. So the 4-stage model is exactly what Ahmet was already explaining. So it's always about data collection, it's data preparation, data analysis, and reporting. Now, Irina touched upon some of the topics that are also mentioned here. So that's not going to be novel. What my emphasis is almost always on the article coding part. So that's why I put this in red. What we do in the paper is that we describe really step by step. So stage 1 in the data collection, how can you do this? So just to give you one, I'm not going to read out these bullets because they're in the paper, but to give you one idea or aspect of a meta-analysis, which is really advancing very, very quickly at the moment, is the reading of the tables that are used in primary studies, but need to be put into an Excel file or in some data storage format. Machine learning and artificial intelligence is really picking up in this respect. So that means that the actual reading of the tables is partly automated. Now that's all very nice. The same holds for the literature review part. So when do you know when you have seen or collected enough manuscripts? I mean, 40 might be a minimum, but suppose you've got 50. Well, 50 sounds like a lot, but if there's 500 real studies out there, then we ideally would like to get closer to the 500 than stop at 50. But how do you know whether there's 500 or 200? There's also tools, technical tools, to help you do these things. So these parts are actually quite well and are evolving quickly. These methods are evolving very quickly. The same applies to a lesser extent, perhaps, because it's more complicated, to the methods used. So Ahmet was already referring to to the random effects model being preferred. That's all correct. You can find a lot of information on this on the web. There's YouTube clips on how to estimate meta-analysis, but it doesn't help you to answer a couple of other questions. The first one being, you've collected all the data only to realize that there's already a meta-analysis on the same topic. I've had people come into my office working on coding data for, I don't know, a year, and then to realize that there was a paper just published in a top journal in marketing or management or IB on their topic. And that's, of course, apart from a panic attack, it's also a question of what is actually novel about a meta-analysis on the same topic. So what we do is also provide some helpful tools. So when is a meta-analysis, under what condition is a meta-analysis on presumably the same topic still of value? Now, to give you one example, it might be that a meta-analysis on a topic has provided a mean effect size with a huge standard error. And that your meta-analysis, where you include 100 or 25 or 50 more studies, actually the uncertainty with which the mean effect size is estimated goes down significantly. Well, that's important, right? That might not be sufficient for top journal publication, but the ability to reduce this uncertainty with which a specific effect is estimated is actually a result that is worth discussing. Now, where's the real beef, if you ask me? I think the real beef is in the coding part. And this is the part where most people struggle. And let me give you an example. If you do, suppose you do a meta-analysis on entry modes in international business. Well, there's papers out there that look at joint ventures. There's papers out there that look at wholly owned subsidiaries, partially owned subsidiaries. Sometimes it's measured in terms of a dummy. Is it a full acquisition? Sometimes it's measured in terms of ownership percentage. So all these dependent variables have been measured in particular ways. So in terms of the figure, these are all the species on the right. And your task is essentially, as a coder, to go to the left to find higher order constructs that allow you to group some of these observations together. And that's really a tough task, because what rules do you use, or how do you put together all these variations in terms of entry mode measurement? Is a wholly owned subsidiary a high commitment entry mode? Is a partially owned subsidiary a low commitment entry mode? But what is partially owned? Is that 10% ownership, or is that 49% ownership? These are nasty questions. And in order to answer these questions, you need an insider. You need someone who has ideally done a primary study on that topic, in this example, an entry mode study. Exactly for this reason, I am quite critical about the conditions under which junior scholars can start to code papers. If they're well informed and well trained, like Irina was explaining, then it might work. If you think that you can just code papers while doing your lit review and you code the papers on the side, I don't think that that is a formula that will lead to a successful paper. I think that is a high risk strategy. So you need almost to be an insider on the topic. Now, what is the future? I think so. This is what I think is the key issue. What is the future? I think meta-analysis really moved beyond taking stock. So if you go back 10 years, every meta-analytical paper would almost start with a sentence, well, results go in all directions and we want to take stock. That's no longer sufficient. So you need to be able to explain more. The search process, as I was just explaining, is getting more and more automated. That also has implications for the team with which you're doing a meta-analysis. Increasingly, you see that librarians and AI specialists are involved to facilitate the search process. I already emphasized the coding process, and what is relatively new is that partly under pressure of open science initiatives, the idea is that if you start coding papers and you make that publicly available, then other people can add new papers on top of that. It's a strategy that has been used in the medical field because new medication comes out. new results come out, and then you add on top of that, and that's considered public knowledge, and people contribute by perhaps adding their own result to that database. Now, what are my discussion points, or the things that I think you need to reflect a little bit on before you engage in a meta-analysis? Ideally, a meta-analysis involves a team member that has published at least one primary study on the topic. In other words, it doesn't have to be a published paper, but ideally you have got someone on board who understands the details of the coding process and the details of, in the example of an entry mode, what the critical differences are between partially owned, wholly owned, full, all those details. You can take any other example that equally applies there. I think there's another risk. There's still many meta-analysis. I think it had cooled down a little bit because the demands for a proper meta-analysis have gone up. But there were overly descriptive papers that were lacking this higher order framework. So ideally, a meta-analysis also helps you to advance theory. Well, to do so, you need to be able to put the result into a theoretical perspective. Of course, the end result is as for all empirical work, but in this case specifically, you create the data points yourself. So these are not objective observations observed in reality. The data points are created by the scholar, him or herself. And that means that there's a lot of sensitivity here, and if you want to put it, scholarly discretion, how to code. Now, if you code in the wrong way, it's garbage in, and that also means that what comes out doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Interestingly, so the coding process is, I think, the most critical, but very often the least transparent part of a meta-analysis. So people describe their methods extensively, but the methods are only as good as, well, the quality of the coding that had to be done before you actually apply the methods. So this is what I had to share about meta-analysis. David, I turn it back to you, and then I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Great job. Great job, everyone. We have a lot of different questions that have come in, some directly to me and some into the chat and some into the Q&A. So I'm going to be putting them to the panel. And this first one's going to go to all three. I would ask you to keep your responses somewhat limited, but more than one word. Is the method only recommended for topics having significant literature and not for new emerging fields? And we're going to go in reverse order on this one. So I'm going to start with Kurt and then go to Irina and then to Ahmet.
Well, I think Irina already gave an answer to this question, right? So I think it's, if you've got a new emerging phenomenon, the problem is you don't have an awful lot of primary studies that have already addressed this issue. And as you need a certain number of primary studies as input, it's going to be difficult to do a meta-analysis on it.
Yeah, and I would just add, just because there is significant literature also on some subject, that again, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody cares about it today. You know, you could do a meta-analysis on some outdated theory that has been since, you know, rethought. So I think you need, yes, you need to have enough, and people care about emerging fields, emerging phenomena. It's just a question of, like, how much is enough, and is there enough interest?
Ahmet? Unmute.
Okay, so by definition, a meta-analysis is the analysis of prior studies. So you have to have a certain number of studies to do a meta-analysis, right? Just like Stuart has mentioned. But I'm not really a big fan of giving numbers like, okay, you need to have this many numbers, 250 studies to have a solid study, because I think there's so much that goes into that 250, and goes back to one of the comments that Stuart has mentioned. It's like, I mean, if you use machine learning techniques and then some artificial intelligence, and then come up with a huge bag of studies that focus on IT capabilities. I'm just making this up. It's not like something that I'm reviewing or anything, but IT capabilities and its impact on firm performance. Technically, you can do a meta-analysis on this, but what do you mean by IT capability, right? I mean, you can have 500 studies that looks at IT capabilities, but what do we mean? The conceptual definition of IT capabilities should really be very clear, and what we're talking about really needs to be precisely defined for us to be able to do a meta-analysis. On the other hand, you can have a very well-defined concept for which you have obtained 35 studies with 2,000 firms or subjects. That is actually a pretty good meta-analysis for me. If you can code all these study characteristics, if they're all published in journals that care about the study characteristics, contextual characteristics, and if you can code those, then you can come up with some pretty solid generalizations and even test some preliminary models using SEM and so on. So I think, that just depends. The answer depends on the topic. The answer depends on the definition. It depends on the systematic rigor of the way you collect your data.
Excellent, excellent. I want to follow up on that with all three of you, actually, because all three of you mentioned the same general issue, which is garbage in, garbage out. But there are a lot of interpretations or aspects of garbage in and garbage out. And I think it may relate to this: are there enough papers, or are there enough studies versus are there enough quality studies? And so what I'd ask is, if you think about that garbage in, garbage out, if you could give the participants just maybe if each of you just sort of spoke to one aspect of garbage that you saw or that you're concerned about as you're reviewing the paper or doing the paper. And I'm going to start with Irina, if I can, on this one, and then go to Shirt and then Ahmet.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think everyone mentioned, why go with 200 if there are 500 studies out there? The thing that I see most people do, right, is limit the level of the journals that they're willing to include, right? They might just say, okay, I'm just going to look at these top journals in discipline. That's going to give you quality for sure, right? These are papers that went through a rigorous review process to start with. I mean, the danger there is that you might leave some good studies. I see a lot of, say, senior professors who just want to do the study they want to do. They don't want to deal with the process of publishing a top level journal anymore, but that doesn't mean the study is no good. So I would, again, I guess my advice, the most concise advice, is I would go and see the most recent metas in the journal that you are intending to submit to, and see what is a standard, and see if that makes sense to you. There's not a one prescriptive answer I think that I can give.
Excellent. Shirt.
I think it goes back to what is in meta-analysis called the file drawer problem. So there's many papers that are not published but might still be very good. This is a traditional problem. So how do you control for that? Now, there's techniques to control for that, but that's not the point I'm going to make now. I think what you need to realize is that the way it has been solved, for example, is not only take top journal publications, but also take book chapters or take conference papers. We know that unfortunately there is a bias in published articles towards obtaining significant results. That also means that papers that are not published might actually show you all kinds of relations that are still there, but might not be significant. still means that these studies have been done and these results are worth including in your meta-analysis. So I think it goes back to the question, how do you deal with quality levels in terms of the input that you put into your model? What I've seen, but that's imperfect, one way that people address this is, for example, include a journal impact factor as a control variable in the meta-analysis, based on the idea that journals with a higher impact factor will be higher quality, meaning by extension that the result or the weight of that particular paper should be higher in the meta-analysis. Now, we can debate impact factors, but that's not the point. The idea is clear, I think.
Ahmet?
I think the question here, generalization to what, right? When you do a meta-analysis, basically you're drawing a sample of studies, and then you try to make generalizations and obtain some aggregate findings using effect sizes, right? So the quality of the journal issue can be addressed very successfully, as Stuart has mentioned. I mean, you can basically use some control variables or run analysis with two samples, provide the first one with good quality journals, however you define them. And I'm sure there are a bunch of articles out there that are going to rank journals. You can use journal rankings to weigh your effect sizes and so on and so forth. I mean, there's so much you can do to address the quality issue. For me, the more critical issue is about the conceptual definition of the constructs, putting everything together and call it, again, if somebody's working on IT capability, I'm terribly sorry, but IT capability. What do you mean by IT capability? Like, and I'm going to go back and be kind of critical of my own research, market orientation. I published my first paper. Our first paper was a JAM meta-analysis on market orientation performance. And we did exactly what you suggested, by the way, Stuart, adjusted for journal quality by weighing the effect sizes using citations, the journal citations index values. But the key issue for us there, and we had to have discussions with the reviewer teams, and rightly so, because they were worried about putting two types of market orientation studies together. One from the cultural perspective, the other was from the behavioral perspective. So those of you who are familiar with the market orientation literature would know that those two major domains represent two different ways of operationalizing market orientation, or what we call now customer centricity. So putting those two together, some reviewers argue that it's actually apples and oranges. One is coming from the behavioral perspective, the other is coming from the cultural perspective. And when you merge them, it's just not garbage in, but it's not really, what is it? Is it grapes that you're obtaining, or oranges, or what is it, right? So for that, we actually split the sample using different effect sizes for studies that use market orientation from cultural perspective and behavioral perspective, included as a control, and so on and so forth. So I think the conceptual rigor of a meta-analysis is really what drives this problem. If you have a bunch of variables that you put and consider and call them, label them as IT capability or market orientation, then you have a problem, because you don't know what the outcome is. The outcome, what you come out of it, is a generalization of, well, capabilities affect performance. Well, there you have a contribution problem, because we know that capabilities affect performance. We don't need a meta-analysis for that.
Excellent, excellent. So my next question is, and I'm reading this, what is the difference between meta-analysis using traditional Pearson R and SEM to meta-analysis using elasticities as input, which uses betas, I believe? Who would like to take that? Any of our panelists care to address that question?
Sure.
it's a highly technical issue. The basic, while this question was raised, I was also thinking about one other issue that was mentioned, and that's related conceptually, at least. It appears not to be related, but it is. And that is, what is the question, what is the difference between a meta-analysis and a systematic review of the literature, which is kind of a conceptual approach. Now, if you do a systematic review, so I'll go back to the coefficient question later on. But if you go back to the fundamental question, what's the difference between the systematic review of the literature and a meta-analysis? Well, in a meta-analysis, you're trying to formalize and get a real empirical result, a mean effect size about on the relationship between A and B. And we're in social sciences, and that raises a nasty issue. So in medicine, it's nice, right? Because you've got one type of medication has been tried here, there, and maybe in another country, and yet another sample, and you want to see on average what is the effect, and maybe the effect is a little bit bigger or smaller for males, for females. So there, the effect size really has real substantive meaning. And I think Irina was actually also getting to that in her presentation. That, well, you want to explain what it means. So if you get a mean effect size of 0.04, yeah, what is that? Is that a lot, or what does that mean in real life? Now that's the difference with a systematic literature review, which is only conceptual. Going back to the difference between the correlations and the coefficients, well, the correlations are part of the. If you look at the correlations, you're essentially using the partial relationship between two variables. If you use the coefficient, you actually have a coefficient while there's control, while you control for all kinds of other variables. So it's a fundamentally different thing. It has nothing to do with causality. It has to do with what you're actually using as a dependent variable, but it has implications for how to interpret it. So going back to the difference between a conceptual literature review and a meta-analysis, the difference between the correlation and the coefficient must be translated as a result that is readily interpretable. So what does that mean? So on the technical side, in the methods part, there's all kinds of good books that Ahmet was also suggesting how to do this. But conceptually, what you're trying to do is put a number on a relationship between A and B.
Excellent. I'm just going to keep going. We have lots of questions. Some are specifically about papers in the review process, which I always find interesting. Go ahead, Ahmet, you wanted to make a point?
I was going to say a couple of things about this distinction between Pearson R, SEM, and elasticity and betas. Those are all different things. You can use Pearson R in an SEM. So those two go together, obviously. You can create an aggregate correlation matrix to be able to run some path analysis. But causality is always a problem there. To address the, because we're talking about correlational research. Effect sizes are Pearson R's. These are correlations. Correlations don't know which directions they go, right? I mean, A affects B, or B can affect A. There's really, it's the theory that determines the direction of causality. So, I mean, at least in social sciences. Of course, you can do experiments, and if you have CB research that you're dealing with actual subjects, and then you can obtain effect sizes from those, and then those are actually well, you know, you can speak to causality to a certain extent, and causality is really a big word in social sciences anyway. But elasticities and use of betas are two separate things. You can use elasticity, price elasticity of advertising. I mean, that's an effect size in and of itself. Betas obtained from multivariate regression analysis are, of course, elasticities at the same time, but they are not comparable. They are oranges and apples. Okay, I really want to re-emphasize this, and we're going to have a debate on this for hours and hours, but we all know that beta coefficients of multivariate regression analysis is contingent, is dependent on what variables you put in your analysis. right? If you put a different control, you're going to obtain different data, unless you have very specific set of circumstances that would allow you to compare the results across those regression analyses using beta coefficients. Is actually not correct, in my personal opinion. And I think Hunter and Schmidt would agree with that. And a couple of other people that I just cited, the books in my slides, would definitely agree with that. So I would caution against the use of beta coefficients obtained from regression analysis unless you fulfill certain very specific requirements. But that really becomes too technical after that point.
Okay, I want to follow up on that because Timo Mandler's question kind of deals with this issue a little bit. And so, but I will ask you to keep the answer short, Ahmet.
You see, I told you, you're gonna get upset with
I know. So,
okay, well, meta-analysis.
Timo states that there is always this issue of causal ordering in meta-analysis, and in a paper that he had written, a reviewer came back and asked them to limit their sample exclusively to experimental evidence to allow for causal claims. He notes, this seems like a drastic step to me. What is your take on the role of causality in meta-analysis, especially MASEM?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's a drastic measure. I agree with that. But of course, it's not wrong to ask that question. I would ask that question as a reviewer myself. And I would want, if it's a top-level journal, I would want at this stage of the meta-analytic development and our requirements in top journals, I would want to hear an answer to that question, because causality is a big question. And I mean, you need to have a very strong theory, one. And second, you have to ensure that alternative explanations can be eliminated. And in some cases, our ability to do that with meta-analysis is limited.
Excellent.
It's a valid question, and it's an important one, but it can be addressed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I've seen in the review process, there's a lot of subsample analysis requests made that, you just kind of go through the process. And sometimes it's much like robustness testing with quantitative strategy research. Given that all of you are working on international work, and oftentimes when you're doing a meta-analysis, you're pulling data from studies that have been done in different countries, I would like to ask Sana's question, which is sort of how do you deal with, or what about the issue of measurement invariance in meta-analysis, and how do we approach that as scholars who might be pulling a study from the Netherlands and a study from Mexico and a study from China, and sort of pulling all that together? Who would like to start on that one? That's a meaty question.
Well, that's a tough one.
That's a tough one, but I think if you think about it, let's unpack it a little bit. So where does the measurement equivalence, or where does it need to be present? Well, first of all, I think the first step where you encounter it is the studies you include. So if you observe studies supposedly measuring the same construct, but done without measurement equivalence, then what you're essentially ending up with is apples and oranges, just like Ahmet was saying. So you're putting something into a bin that cannot be put together in the same bin. So that's level one, I would say. But suppose you have apples that you can put in the same bin. So they're all measured in the same way. This is very unlikely to be true, but let's assume for the sake of it that all these studies have addressed measurement equivalence in a perfect way, and all these studies can be put together and can be considered apples. Then still, the end result you get is saying something about a particular relationship. But the relationship might still differ between countries. So that's on top of the fact that there's measurement equivalence, you also have to think about, well, you find a mean effect size between A and B, based on all the apples you put into the bin. but the relationship between A and B might be stronger or weaker depending on the context in which it is done. Now, measurement equivalence very often applies in terms of cultural differences and language-related differences. So that's another way to explore this. So if you have apples and oranges and you think you can put them in one bin, well, the next step would be, are there cross-country differences in the effect size? And somehow do these cross-country differences in the effect size logically hang together with, for example, response styles? This is really nasty because it would force you to go back to the original studies, see whether how they were done, what is the response style, how is it measured. But it all goes back to the same issue. You need to be really knowing what you're doing and an insider to the field in order to understand if you're throwing apples in a bin or apples and oranges in a bin.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, sorry, I don't want to kind of.
Well, I think that some of this maybe goes back to the question we had earlier, right? How do you figure out the quality? I think some of that might be controlled by, by the types of journals that publish these studies, right? Like if you are going to measure in an original study, you're going to measure something that is common for your field, common at like the standard for, maybe that quality of research. So I think some of it sort of takes care of itself if you're really diligent and have the sensical way to set the scope for the original articles, the original studies that you're getting, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I think Stuart is a great point. I think if this is a measurement issue and if it's addressed at the study level, then as a meta-analyst, I'm not really that concerned about that issue, right? Because at the end of the day, the researchers demonstrate that there's equivalence at the study level. And when you pull those studies from those contexts, what remains is the variation due to some other factors in those effect sizes. But if there's no measurement equivalence assessment, and which is the case in most studies, then we have a problem here because, well, the true differences in the effect sizes might be because of these study characteristics and substantial variables of interest that we're talking about, but also because of measurement. But you can treat that as a study characteristic as well, right? So you can absorb and throw that into the error and use it as a control variable. It's just a dummy. And you can just use, they did test for invariance or not. That's a study characteristic, because that would basically create measurement error in your model, right? And measurement error can be captured in the effect size by introducing some control variables. Not a perfect way to deal with that issue, but if I had that question from Sana as a reviewer, that's how I would treat it.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I'm going to ask two questions kind of together because I think they hang together, and I think they address, or I think that they are related to the comment Jared had been talking about with the difference between systematic review and a meta-analysis. So I think it's in that same ballpark, but I want to make sure we get these in. The first is, can the panelists compare and contrast other taking stock options such as bibliometric analysis, literature reviews with meta-analysis? Do these complement each other or work for very different purposes? And the second question is, rather than incorporating a lack of meta-analysis into the framing of a research problem, can the researcher apply meta-analysis as a methodology for obtaining data, or for obtaining and data analyzing for addressing general research problems, sort of as an almost like where's the field going kind of, which, so you've got bibliometric, you've got other quantitative approaches, given that we're all able to pull a lot of data from, using, as you were saying, different meta-analytic tools or different ML, machine learning, AI tools, easy scrape tools. How do all of these sort of fit together from the standpoint of advancing scientific knowledge? And I asked that in such a bad way, no one's going to answer that.
Oh, I was already about to say, Irina, floor is yours.
This is I think this is a really tough question that has a lot of parts in it. And I tend to read specific journals. I tend to review for only specific journals. So I'm just going to go with what I know. We're actually right now working on a study, not a meta-analysis. It's about how to do conceptual pieces in general. And a lot of those are going to be these systematic reviews. I think sometimes you have to think from the perspective of the editor, right? Like that's going to be the person who determines the fate of your research. So both review articles and metas tend to get highly cited, right? Which editors like for their impact factor. I personally think, this is my personal opinion, I think it's much tougher to convince reviewers of your contribution in a pure review piece with no meta-analysis. And as a reviewer, also, I've seen these manuscripts where, they do a great job. And my natural question is, okay, like given it seems like you've done the thorough job of reviewing whatever literature, why not have a meta-analysis? Like, why not, this goes back to the point somebody already made, like, why not go in and quantify? And, the big difference is like the review piece is going to be, the systematic review piece is going to be way more subjective in terms of the studies they pick. So that doesn't necessarily give you confidence about the state of the art of whatever domain. I think to see where the field is going, some of these other approaches this person has mentioned, I think they have great merit. And I think I normally see these type of analyses in, it might be an editorial, a commentary, or it might be just, a little part of the intro trying to motivate whatever problem they're studying. So I think they all have merits, and I don't necessarily think that it's either or. And that's actually another point I was going to make on meta-analyses. Like you can be creative. Meta-analysis can be one study of 3 studies you have in the paper. So I think they have their merits, and people shouldn't necessarily think of which one do I choose.
Excellent. Unless someone really wants to get in, I'll move on to another question if that's okay, because I think you did a great job, Irina, of hitting that and building on the others. And I do think that there is this issue in our field, and we all 4 of us review a lot of meta-analyses, because once you've published one, you continually seem to be on that reviewer set to get them. What is your key tips when reviewing a meta-analysis paper, given that so many reviewers may lack the key ingredient in reviewing such papers? We'll start with.
Yeah, that's exactly the reason why we wrote our GIBS piece, to help readers or reviewers who are not well versed in meta-analysis. Okay, what do you need to look for? What do you need to ask for? What is reasonable to ask when you're asked to review? So you're an expert on entry modes, and you're asked to review a paper which does a meta-analysis on entry mode. So what is a reasonable thing to ask for? Personally, but I've emphasized this throughout the talk I gave, I would immediately go for the coding part. So what is the key construct? How was it measured? And what is your way of grouping it together under a new label or under a new header? And does that make some logical sense? And more often than not, actually, you'll find lots of opportunities to debate and criticize that.
Ahmet?
Yeah, I agree. I think the key issue is, well, there are multiple key issues as always, and I think Stuart's article, they do a pretty good job of summarizing the most important pieces that the authors need to go through. Conceptual development is very important, which starts with the definition of the constructs, because that's where you start collecting your articles, your studies. And then, of course, this issue about transparency. I cannot overemphasize the importance of transparency, which is well defined in your articles. Your basically PRISM principles. I think, we have to bring those to GIBS and ask from every single meta-analysis to provide something like the process, because PRISM was primarily written for other fields as well. So it's not, with behavioral research, I think we may need to make some adjustments to some of those requirements. But whenever I see, okay, we did a Google search and got 2,500 hits, and then we have 150 studies that we're analyzing out of all of that. That just kind of, okay, come on, you have to go through that process and tell me how you came down from 2,500 hits to 150. Somehow, it's just, I should be able to replicate what you did and then get to some, it's a representativeness issue. Let's not forget, it's the idea that you're drawing a representative sample from the population of studies out there. That's the idea of a meta-analysis. And if the reviewers convince me that's a representative sample, I'm fine with that. It doesn't have to be 1 million studies, but how that 150 is representative of 1.5 million is my question. So those are really the kinds of issues, that seem to be red flags for me.
Excellent. Irina?
Well, I would just add, for me as a reviewer, I would always start with big picture. Is this, is the question they're asking, is that worth knowing answer to? And if the answer is, and if that answer hasn't been provided in some satisfactory way, through other articles, if the answer to that is yes, if the answer to me as a reviewer is yes, it's worth knowing, then I'll dig deeper into, how they searched, whether they have any methodological challenges, whether they corrected for this or that. But, it might be that the answer is no. And then, as a reviewer, you might be less motivated to look into other problems if you think the topic isn't worthwhile.
Excellent. Next question is, what is your perspective? What do you think about QCA, or qualitative comparative analysis?
Yeah, it's a different tool. It's a different tool that serves a different purpose, and more fundamentally, what you're doing with FSQCA or QCA is you're trying, often based on your qualitative data, or trying to code that in some way. I think the overlap is that you're partly generating your own data. So that's the overlap between the two methods. The fundamental difference is that in a meta-analysis, you're after a main effect and some moderators. In an FSQCA, you're after a contingency structure. You're after a structure which leads different profiles that are associated with particular outcomes. That's a fundamentally different thing you're after. There's some overlap, as I said, in terms of the coding, perhaps, that there's lots of scholarly discretion in that. But otherwise, I would say these are really fundamentally different methods.
Excellent, thank you. Our time is coming to a close, but I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to share one last piece of advice if you haven't had a chance to share it, or if a question didn't come up that you thought should have come up. If you'd like to just bring that forward, and we'll go with our author ordership for the panel. So we'll start with Ahmet, then do Irina, and then do Shirt, and then I'll do a brief closing. Ahmet?
I think I've talked a lot, so Don't have anything to add. I just wanted to thank everybody as one of the co-hosts, typically for the research spotlights. This time, I had the pleasure to serve as a panelist, but I just wanted to thank everyone and thank Texas A&M, CIBERs for organizing all of this, and Katie and Monica, who's not here today, but it's a great pleasure to work with you.
Excellent. Irina, any parting thoughts for our participants?
Well, I think, we just, I would just want to say, a lot of what we've been talking today is, okay, like you need to be an expert in the domain. It's a lot of work coding, may sound discouraging in terms of motivating people to do metas, but they are useful. I feel like when you come to a clear answer, like, oh, hey, like, how does this matter? How much does this matter? When does it matter? A lot of times these are important questions to know answers to. So I just don't want this talk about all the difficulties you might encounter in the process to dissuade people from engaging in meta-analytic research. So best of luck to everybody that's been listening. There are a ton of resources online that can guide you like step by step. They can show you the most advanced things that you need to do, so it's not so daunting. And thank you for everybody, to everybody who put this together and invited us as panelists.
Excellent. Sure.
That's the only thing I would like to add. I want to thank everyone for their attention, the questions, and David for moderating the session.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you to all of the participants. A big shout out to Rhonda at Michigan State University for her help, and obviously my cohort in this with Ahmet. We run these together, and I forced him to be a panelist, and he did a fabulous job. And I can't thank you enough, Irina and Shirt, for joining us, and Katie for allowing us this opportunity to share research with the broader academic community. We thank you all for participating today, and we wish you great success as you journey into meta-analytic research. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.